You will watch your daughters freeze before Christmas, Mrs. Norcross. Then you will follow them. Roscoe Thorburn spoke those words standing in his own yard on October 15th, 1886, his voice carrying the flat certainty of a man who had buried too many people in Dakota soil. He was 60 years old, broad-shouldered, with hands that looked carved from the same timber he burned in his stove. 11 winters in this territory had taught him to recognize death before it arrived, and he saw it now in the widow standing before him with two small girls clutching her skirts. Callista Norcross had walked 5 kilometers that morning from her father's claim to Thorburn's farm, her daughters trailing behind like shadows. Nerissa was 5, Temperance was 3, both dressed in layers that made their limbs move stiffly like wooden dolls handled by careful hands. The October wind cut through their coats as if the fabric were made of paper. She had brought them deliberately, hoping the sight of children might soften whatever price Thorburn named for firewood. She needed 8 cubic meters of oak to survive the winter. She had $30 in cash and nothing else to bargain with except the possibility of a man's mercy. Thorburn's farm sprawled across land 4 times larger than her father's claim. His house rose 2 stories built from milled lumber hauled across 200 kilometers of prairie. A barn stood behind it, solid enough to shelter 20 head of cattle through the worst blizzards. And beside the barn, stacked under a slanted roof that kept snow from settling, was a wood pile that stretched 12 meters long and rose over 2 meters high. The smell of burning oak drifted from his chimney, rich and heavy in the cold air. He did not invite her inside. He studied her as she approached, his gaze moving from her face to the girls and back again. He did not smile. Callista wondered if he ever did anymore, not after what winter had taken from him. "How much do you have now?" She hesitated. The truth sat like a stone in her chest, but lying would only delay the inevitable. "None." Thorburn repeated the word as if tasting it, letting it settle between them. His posture shifted, a tightening in his shoulders that suggested the conclusion he had already reached. "Your father had no wood stockpiled when he died. I found nothing. No pile, no cut logs, nothing prepared. You have been here how long?" 3 weeks. He turned and looked north toward the horizon where thin clouds raced across a sky the color of old iron. The wind had shifted that morning, coming now from the northwest, carrying the first real bite of winter. "Do you know how much wood you need to survive a winter here?" Callista had calculated it on paper by candlelight, sitting at the rough table her father had built from scrap lumber. She knew the numbers the way she knew her daughters' faces. 6 cubic meters, maybe 7 or 8, depending on how cold it gets. 8, Thorburn's voice was flat, minimum. 10 would be safer. Your father's cabin is small but poorly sealed. Wind passes through those tar paper walls like they are made of lace. You will burn 8 cubic meters just to keep those girls from freezing in their sleep. Then he told her about his first wife, Clementine, the winter of 1880 to 81. He had gone to town for supplies and got trapped by a blizzard that lasted 9 days. When he finally made it back, they had frozen in the cabin, Clementine and his 2 infant sons. She had burned every stick of furniture trying to stay warm, but the wood ran out and the cold did not. He looked at Nerissa and Temperance still waiting by the fence. That is when he said it, the sentence that would echo through every cold night Callista spent in Dakota for the rest of her life. "You will watch those girls freeze to death before Christmas. Then you will follow them. Sell now while you can still walk to town." Callista gathered her daughters without responding and began the 5-kilometer walk back to her father's claim. The wind cut harder on the return journey, as if the land itself wanted to prove Thorburn right. Nerissa asked why they had not gotten any wood. Temperance asked when they could go home. At the crossroads, where the path split one direction leading back to the cabin and the other toward Coopertown, where a stagecoach ran twice weekly to Minneapolis, Callista stopped walking. Temperance tugged her hand. Mama, which way do we go? Callista stood motionless for 30 seconds, staring down the road to Coopertown. She could see the route clearly. A day's walk to town, a ticket to Minneapolis, a rented room above a laundry where she could push needles through fabric 16 hours a day and keep her daughters alive in a city that did not actively try to murder them every winter. The arithmetic was simple. The choice was obvious. Every reasonable person she had met in Dakota had told her the same thing. Leave. Nerissa coughed. The sound was dry and sharp and thin, cutting through the wind like a blade drawn across glass. Callista turned toward the cabin. This was home now, she told them. But the words felt hollow even as she spoke them. That night, after the girls fell asleep under every blanket she owned, Callista sat at the table with a pencil and paper, working the arithmetic Thorburn had given her. 8 cubic meters minimum, 7 weeks maximum before real winter arrived. 1 cubic meter required 3 full days of labor from a strong man who knew how to work an axe. She was not strong, she was not a man, and her daughters needed her attention every day. She had already tried cutting cottonwood. For 3 weeks she had walked to the nearest grove 2 kilometers from the cabin and swung her father's axe at trunks that seemed to absorb the blows without yielding. The blade was dull, the handle loose, and her shoulders screamed after 20 minutes. In 21 days of effort, she had managed to cut, split, and haul perhaps 3/4 of a cubic meter. At that rate, she would have maybe 2 cubic meters by mid-November. Enough for perhaps 3 weeks of heat if she burned sparingly. The numbers closed around her like walls with no doors. Her father's last letter, written 3 weeks before his death, sat in the trunk beside his wool coat. She had read it a dozen times without understanding the final paragraph. The well holds what you need. Trust what I built. She had assumed he meant water, that the well would eventually strike an aquifer if she kept digging. But the well was 9 meters deep and dry as bone, and Norval Norcross had stopped excavating years ago. Everyone in the county agreed it was proof he had lost his sense before dying. What sane man spent years on a well that produced nothing? Callista pulled the letter out now and read it again by candlelight. The well holds what you need, not water, what you need. In her father's trunk, she also found a small notebook written entirely in Norwegian. She could read only fragments, words scattered across pages of dense handwriting. Dip, stein, temperature, tray, deep, stone, temperature, 3. The notebook felt important in ways she could not articulate, but the language sat beyond her reach, and she dared not ask anyone to translate it. Not yet. Not until she understood what her father had been hiding. 2 days later, Reverend Rufus Langford arrived at Callista's cabin, carrying a loaf of bread wrapped in cloth and the particular expression of a man who believed he was performing God's work. He was 55, lean, with a voice trained for pulpits and a certainty about the world that left no room for outcomes he had not anticipated. He sat at Callista's table, accepted coffee he did not drink, and delivered his message with the practiced gentleness of someone accustomed to telling people things they did not want to hear. God does not ask women to die for pride, Callista. Your daughters need a real home, not a tar paper shack on land that cannot sustain them. I appreciate your concern, Reverend. Langford leaned forward, his hands folded on the table in a posture that was half prayer and half negotiation. I intend to mention your situation at Sunday service, not by name, of course, simply to ask the congregation to pray for those among us who are struggling. Perhaps the community can help you see what is best for your children. Callista understood immediately. Once the entire congregation knew she was the woman too stubborn to leave, the narrative would shift. She would no longer be a grieving daughter trying to keep her father's land. She would be the mother whose pride endangered her children. The kind of woman the community would feel justified in overriding. She thanked Langford for the bread and walked him to the door. He paused on the threshold and turned back with an expression that mixed compassion with something harder. Your father was a good man, Callista, but he also died alone out here. Do not repeat his mistake. The words hit exactly where they were aimed, not because they were cruel, but because part of her feared they were true. 3 days after Langford's visit, Ransom Whitaker rode up to the cabin on a gray gelding that looked as cold and calculating as its owner. Whitaker was about 50, widowed with 3 grown sons who worked his land alongside him. He owned 256 hectares that bordered Callista's claim to the north and east. He had tried twice to buy Norval's land while the old man was still alive. Both offers had been refused with the kind of stubborn politeness that left no room for negotiation. Whitaker dismounted and stood in the yard ostensibly to offer condolences, but more likely to assess the situation firsthand. His eyes moved with the efficiency of an inventory clerk cataloging everything: the well cover, the cabin, the modest pile of cottonwood Callista had accumulated near the door. He took it all in and revealed nothing. Mrs. Norcross, he touched the brim of his hat without removing it, a gesture that managed to be both courteous and dismissive. Came to offer my sympathies regarding your father. He was a good man. Thank you. Also came to renew my offer for the land. It is not for sale. You have not heard my price yet. Does not matter. This land belonged to my father. Now it is mine. I intend to prove up the claim. Whitaker smiled, and the expression held the warmth of river ice in January. Mrs. Norcross, you have been here, 6 weeks? 7. I do not see any woodpile worth mentioning. I do not see improvements. I do not see any sign you are preparing for winter at all. Callista straightened, despite the exhaustion pulling at her bones. You see what I choose to show you. I see a woman alone with 2 small girls. No husband, no help, no fuel. I see a dry well and a tar paper shack that will not hold heat past Thanksgiving. I see someone who will be dead by Christmas if she does not accept help. Your offer is not help, Mr. Whitaker. It is $25 and a wagon ride to Coopertown so you can claim my father's land before the grass grows over his grave. Something hardened in Whitaker's eyes, though his voice remained level. Your father knew when to hold his ground and when to fold. He would not let pride kill his grandchildren. My father spent 7 years building something on this land. I will not surrender it because you have decided I cannot keep it. You cannot keep it. Whitaker leaned forward in the saddle, his voice taking on the patient tone of a man explaining simple arithmetic to a child. That is not opinion, Mrs. Norcross. That is mathematics. You need 8 cubic meters minimum. What do you have half a cubic meter visible out here? Maybe another half hidden somewhere I cannot see. That is not courage. That is suicide. I have what I need. You have a dry well and a dead father. Whitaker straightened, adjusting his reins. My offer expires with the first snow. After that, I will simply wait. Spring will decide the matter for both of us. He turned his horse. Behind him at the fence line, his eldest son Silas sat on a bay mare waiting. Callista saw Silas look toward the cabin through the window, where Nerissa's face pressed against the glass. He met Callista's eyes for a moment, and something crossed his expression. He dipped his chin, a small nod, almost imperceptible, almost an apology. Then he followed his father down the road without looking back. Callista stood by the well cover with her hands shaking, not from cold, from rage she could not afford to show. Whitaker was right about the arithmetic, she knew it, but he did not know about the well. She did not know about the well yet either. 400 miles east, and 6 years earlier in the summer of 1880, Norval Norcross stood at the bottom of a dry well 4 meters deep and pressed his palm against the stone wall. No water. There would never be water. The rock formation beneath this section of Dakota prairie directed aquifers deeper than any single man could reach with hand tools. He had known this for a month since hitting the dense layer of sedimentary stone that geologists would have identified immediately as impermeable. But Norval did not stop digging. He stopped looking for water. What he found instead was something that 11 Dakota winters had taught him to value more than any aquifer. Temperature. Constant, unchanging, indifferent to the seasons raging above. At 4 meters deep, the summer heat could not reach him. At 6 meters, the killing cold of January would be equally powerless. The Earth at this depth maintained a stable temperature roughly 10 degrees Celsius year-round, below the frost line, below the reach of any winter that Dakota could produce. Standing in that dry well with his shirt soaked through and his back aching from 6 months of excavation, Norval Norcross conceived a plan that would take him 7 years to complete, destroy his body, save his daughter's life, and outlast every person who witnessed any part of it. He began digging horizontally. That night, he opened the Norwegian notebook that would eventually confuse his daughter and wrote his first entry about what he called the Well Project. The well has no water, but it has something more valuable: stable temperature where seasonal variation cannot reach. If Callista comes after I am gone, and my heart tells me she will come, she will need fuel, not water. Beginning first chamber today. He did not write to Callista about the project. He wrote to her about weather and crops and the color of the prairie in autumn. In a separate letter, one of dozens he sent to Minneapolis over the following years, he included a sentence that Callista read and dismissed as the rambling of a lonely old man growing eccentric in isolation. My dear daughter, winter out here teaches you that the thing you do not prepare for is the thing that kills you. I am preparing for a winter I will not be here to see. I do not know when it comes, but I know it will come. Callista, 24 years old, nursing baby Nerissa in a rented room above a laundry in Minneapolis, read those words and felt a pang of worry about her father's mental state. She did not write back about the sentence. She told him Nerissa had started smiling and asked if he needed anything from the city. Norval needed nothing from the city, he needed time. Over the next 2 years, he hauled fieldstone from creek beds 3 kilometers away, lining the walls of a horizontal tunnel that extended from the well shaft into a chamber 5 meters wide and 6 meters long. He cut timber for bracing, fitting each beam with joints that distributed weight across the ceiling and walls in patterns he worked out through trial and error, and the instinct of a man who had built with wood his entire life. He hauled oak from creek bottoms 15 kilometers southwest, hiding it under canvas beneath loads of cottonwood that anyone watching would assume was for his cabin stove. Neighbors saw him working. They assumed he was still trying to strike water because that was what you dug wells for. No one asked why the excavated earth kept piling up beside the well site long after any reasonable man would have abandoned the project. No one wondered why Norval Norcross spent his evenings hauling stone instead of resting. They simply added it to the list of evidence that Norval was stubborn, possibly foolish, and certainly alone in ways that might be affecting his judgment. He was alone, but his judgment was immaculate. Back in October 1886, the oak smoke changed everything. Callista had found a few pieces of oak near the well fragments left over from some project her father had abandoned. She burned them in the stove, and the cabin transformed. For the first time since arriving, the air inside felt genuinely warm. The girls stopped shivering. The frost on the windows began to melt. But oak smoke is not cottonwood smoke. It rises thicker, darker, carrying a scent that anyone who has burned both woods recognizes immediately. And in a territory where everyone knew everyone else's business, that smoke rising from the Norcross chimney was a signal fire announcing a mystery that demanded explanation. Philomena Satterley appeared at Callista's door the next morning, carrying a basket that supposedly held surplus eggs. She was a widow in her early 40s with a 16-year-old son named Barnett, and a claim that bordered Callista's to the west. 9 Dakota winters had taught her every survival trick worth knowing, and she stood in the doorway with her nose slightly raised, sampling the air like a hound picking up a scent. "You are burning oak." Callista's heart kicked against her ribs, but she kept her voice steady. "Found some reserves my father had hidden." "Your father never had oak. Norval burned cottonwood like everyone else. He must have traded for it before he died." Ruth's eyes narrowed, her gaze moving past Callista's shoulder to the small stack of wood visible near the stove. "How much do you have?" "Not much. Maybe enough for a few weeks." "Where was it hidden?" Callista forced herself to meet Ruth's eyes without flinching. "Under the cabin floor, between the boards." Ruth's gaze dropped to the floor beneath her feet. Braided rag rugs over packed earth. No boards, no wooden floor. No place to hide anything. For a long moment, neither woman spoke. Then Ruth shifted the basket in her hands and offered a smile that did not reach her eyes. "I see." She left 20 minutes later, eggs still in the basket, but she turned back once to look at the smoke rising from Callista's chimney. Callista watched her go and understood that the interrogation had just begun. Ruth would talk. She would tell the other settlers that the Norcross widow had oak smoke coming from a cabin, with no visible wood pile, no money, and no explanation that held together under scrutiny. That evening, Callista saw Barnett Satterley standing outside her fence in the failing light. He did not approach the cabin. He stood motionless for 5 minutes, his eyes fixed on the well, then turned and walked back toward his mother's claim. Callista watched from the window with her hand on Nerissa's shoulder and knew with certainty that Ruth had sent her son to scout. 3 days later, Hortense Thorburn came. She arrived while her husband Roscoe was in Coopertown, buying supplies, a timing that Callista understood was deliberate. Agnes was 45, quiet in the way of women who had learned that silence was safer than speech in certain marriages, but possessed of a stubborn compassion that her husband's pragmatism could not fully extinguish. She carried a tin of rendered lard and a poultice of dried herbs wrapped in muslin. "Roscoe does not know I am here," she said, stepping inside without waiting for an invitation. "He forbids me from helping you. He says helping you only prolongs suffering. But I lost 2 children in the winter of 1881, same blizzard that killed his first wife and boys. I was his neighbor then before we married. I know what it looks like when children freeze. I will not watch it happen again if I can prevent it." She pressed the poultice into Callista's hands. "For Nerissa's cough, mullein and horehound. Brew it as tea 3 times daily." Then she sat at the table and delivered the information she had actually come to share. "Whitaker has been talking to the territorial surveyor. He told Roscoe your land will revert to public domain before Christmas. He is not waiting for you to fell Callista. He is building the paperwork to take your claim the moment you miss a filing deadline or fail to demonstrate sufficient improvement. Roscoe agreed to serve as witness if Whitaker files." The words landed like stones dropped into still water, each one sending ripples outward into implications Callista had not considered. Roscoe Thorburn, the man who had predicted her death with such clinical certainty, was not merely pessimistic. He was actively cooperating with the man trying to take her land. Why would Roscoe help him? Agnes looked at her hands. "Roscoe does not hate you. He genuinely believes you will die out here, and he thinks helping Whitaker acquire the land quickly is the most merciful outcome. In his mind, the faster you lose the claim, the faster you leave, the faster your daughters survive. He thinks it is kindness." She paused. But if you are alive in March, if you are standing here with a warm cabin and healthy children, when the snow melts, Roscoe will have to admit he was wrong. And Roscoe Thorburn would rather swallow hot coals than admit he was wrong about anything. Agnes stood and pulled her coat tight. Do not tell Roscoe I came, and if you have any secret, any advantage you have not shown, keep it hidden. Everyone out here watches, but not everyone watches because they care about you. She left as the first heavy clouds of the season rolled across the western horizon. Callista stood in the doorway and felt the shape of her situation change. She was not simply fighting winter. She was fighting a legal clock she had not known was ticking, held by a man who had calculated her failure as precisely as he calculated crop yields. That night, after Nerissa and Temperance fell asleep, Callista searched her father's belongings with the systematic thoroughness of someone seeing them for the first time. His letters to her mother, dead since 1882, his Bible with annotations in Norwegian she could not read, his pipe, his tools, his spare shirt. And then in the lining of his wool coat, she found a pocket she had missed during her first search. The stitching was careful, almost invisible, the kind of work her father would have done slowly over multiple evenings, each stitch placed with the precision of a man who understood that what you hide matters more than what you show. Inside the pocket, a brass key. She recognized it immediately. The minister who had buried her father had removed it from around Norval's neck and placed it in an envelope with his other effects. Callista had set it aside without much thought, assuming it opened a toolbox or an empty trunk. Now she turned it over in her hands, feeling the weight of it. Brass, carefully made, worn smooth from years of handling. Her father had carried this key every day, worn it on a cord against his chest like a talisman. That suggested value. That suggested something worth protecting. Callista looked toward the window, toward the darkness beyond, where the well sat 15 meters from the cabin door. The well everyone called Norval's Folly, the dry hole he had spent 7 years excavating and lining with fieldstone. The project he had maintained obsessively, despite never producing a single drop of water. The well had a cover, heavy oak planks her father had cut and fitted with unusual care. And on that cover, barely visible in daylight, was a brass lock. She waited until she was certain both daughters were deeply asleep. Then she pulled on her father's coat, took the oil lantern from its hook, and walked across the frozen yard to the well. November wind cut through the wool. The temperature had dropped to perhaps -10, cold enough that her breath came out in clouds that vanished immediately. The lock was stiff from disuse, the mechanism frozen by weather and time. Callista worked the key carefully, feeling resistance. Then a small click as the tumblers released. She set the lock aside and pulled the planks away one by one. Each piece of oak was heavy, solid, fitted so precisely that removing them felt like dismantling something sacred. Beneath the cover was darkness. The well shaft dropped straight down, stone walls descending into black. But built into those walls at regular intervals were wooden rungs, a ladder her father had constructed with the same care he had given everything else. Callista hooked the lantern onto her belt and began to descend. The air changed as she went down degree by degree, but the change felt different from surface cold. This was stable, constant, as if the seasons above were a rumor that could not penetrate this depth. 3 meters down, 4.5, 6. At 6 meters, she noticed a stone that did not match the others. Same color, same size, but set differently. Recessed slightly with a thin groove visible around its edges in the lantern light. Callista pressed her palm against it and felt movement. She worked her fingers into the crack and pulled. The stone shifted outward, revealing an iron ring mounted into what appeared to be a door made of oak beams fitted together with mortise and tenon joints. She pulled the ring, half expecting resistance, but the door swung open with such smooth precision it seemed to float, counterbalanced, built to move with minimal effort by a man who understood that the person opening this door might be exhausted, injured, desperate, or all three. Behind the door was a tunnel horizontal lined with timber, leading away from the well shaft into absolute darkness. Callista held the lantern forward and stepped inside. The tunnel ran perhaps 5 meters before opening into a chamber that took her breath away. The ceiling was low, barely 2 meters, but the space stretched 5 meters wide and 6 meters long. Timber frames rose from floor to ceiling, the gaps filled with compacted earth. The air smelled of dry wood and stone and nothing else. No mold, no decay, no moisture. And the chamber was not empty. Firewood, stacked from floor to ceiling, filling 2/3 of the available space. Oak, all of it split into uniform pieces sized perfectly for one-handed carrying. Callista picked up a piece and brought it close to the lantern, examining the grain. Dry. No insect damage, no rot. Her father had cured this wood before storing it, and the constant underground temperature had preserved it in perfect condition. She began counting stacks, estimating volume the way her father had taught her as a girl. 2.5 cubic meters, maybe slightly more. Enough for 6 weeks at her current consumption rate. Not enough for winter. Not nearly enough. She sank down onto the hard dirt floor surrounded by her father's work and felt hope collapse into something heavier than despair. He had tried. He had built this vault, hauled the oak piece by piece, split it all by hand, carried it down into the earth. But he had not finished. Death had taken him before he could stockpile enough to ensure survival. Then she saw the markings on the wall, charcoal lines drawn directly on the timber frame, a diagram showing 3 connected chambers labeled A, B, and C. Chamber A, the one she stood in now, was marked with 2.5 in her father's handwriting. Chambers B and C were drawn larger with dotted lines suggesting locations and connections she did not yet understand. Beneath the diagram, written in Norwegian, "Where roots drink the oak sleeps. Count paces from the thirsty stones. What the frost cannot reach, the wood cannot rot." A riddle. Her father had left her a riddle carved in charcoal on a chamber wall 6 meters underground. And below the riddle, in smaller letters, nearly hidden by shadow, a line that made Callista's throat close. "E, if you are reading this, you are stronger than you think. Do not stop here." E, her initial, written directly to her. Not to anyone who might stumble upon this place. To her. Norval Norcross had known his daughter would come, had known she would find the key, open the lock, descend the ladder, discover the door, had known all of it, and had left her not just fuel but a message that reached across death with the quiet confidence of a man who understood his child completely. Callista climbed back to the surface and locked the well with hands that would not stop trembling. The wind had picked up, carrying the smell of snow that had not yet fallen but would soon. She returned to the cabin where her daughter slept undisturbed, unaware that beneath the frozen ground lay a puzzle their mother had to solve or watch them die. She stood at the window looking out at the well. The diagram showed 3 chambers. She had found one. 2 remained somewhere beneath 16 hectares of Dakota prairie, hidden behind riddles written in a language she half understood by a father who had spent 7 years building something no one else could see. In the notebook, she turned to the last page. One word she could read clearly. Trey. Norwegian for 3. 3 chambers. 3 chances. And winter was coming. In July of 1886, 1 month before his heart failed him for the last time, Norval Norcross descended the ladder into Chamber C and placed the final piece of oak into position. His hands were shaking. They had been shaking for weeks now, a tremor that started in his fingers and worked inward toward his chest, where something fluttered and skipped in rhythms that no longer resembled a healthy heartbeat. He had carried this last piece of oak 15 kilometers from the creek bottom, split it with an axe his shoulders could barely lift, and lowered it on a rope through 9 meters of stone and darkness. It weighed perhaps 10 kilograms. It nearly killed him. He stood in the deepest chamber, the one that had taken him 3 years to excavate beneath Chamber B, and looked at what he had built. Floor to ceiling, wall to wall, oak arranged in rows with small gaps for air circulation, perfectly preserved by conditions that would remain unchanged long after his bones returned to the prairie soil above. Norval took a piece of charcoal from his pocket and wrote on the timber frame, 3 chambers, 3 chances. 1 holds heat, 2 hold hope, all 3 hold love. He added the date, July 1886. Then he began the climb back to the surface. It took him 40 minutes. 6 years ago, it had taken 8. At the top of the well, sitting on the stone rim with his legs dangling into the shaft, he watched the sun descend toward the western horizon and wrote the last letter he would ever send to Minneapolis. The well holds what you need. Trust what I built. He sealed the envelope, addressed it to Callista, and walked to the post office in Coopertown the following morning. He died 6 weeks later, alone in the cabin, sitting in the chair beside the cold stove, with the brass key still hanging around his neck. He had finished. Barely, but he had finished. Callista did not know any of this in late October 1886, as she spent 4 days searching for Chamber B. She knew only the diagram on the wall, the riddle in Norwegian, and the conviction that her father had not built one chamber to save her life, only to leave the job incomplete. Where roots drink, the oak sleeps, count paces from the thirsty stones. During daylight hours, she maintained appearances. She cared for Nerissa, and Temperance fed them oatmeal, and the last of the salt pork hauled small amounts of wood from Chamber A, using the pulley system her father had installed above the well. She had initially mistaken it for decoration. Now she understood it was infrastructure built to move weight from 9 meters below ground to the surface with efficiency that turned the impossible into merely exhausting. She stacked wood visibly near the cabin door, building a modest pile that anyone passing would interpret as preparation. At night, after the girls slept, she took the lantern and walked the claim. Thirsty stones. She measured paces from the well in every direction, counting under her breath, searching for anything that qualified. On the 4th night, at 50 paces southeast, she found a pile of fieldstones that looked natural but had a regularity that caught her eye. Stones placed by weather tumble randomly. These formed a rough circle with gaps that aligned too precisely to be accidental. She began removing stones, working quietly despite knowing her nearest neighbor was more than a kilometer away. Beneath the top layer, she found wooden boards weathered but manufactured, a hatch, and on that hatch another brass lock. The key fit, the lock opened. She descended carefully, counting rungs. At 6 meters depth, she found a door identical to the one in Chamber A. She opened it. Chamber B was roughly the same size as its counterpart, and for a moment Callista felt the surge of relief that comes from finding exactly what you expected. Then she heard it. Water. Not flowing, not dripping. Just the soft, almost imperceptible sound of moisture existing where it should not. The entire southwest corner was submerged. Spring seepage. Snowmelt from previous years had found its way through the soil and pooled where the floor dipped slightly, forming a shallow lake perhaps 10 centimeters deep that covered nearly half the chamber. The air down here carried a smell that Chamber A did not. Damp earth and the sweet, sickly odor of wood beginning to rot. Callista waited in, lantern held high, and assessed the damage. The wood stacked in the elevated sections was fine. Cured oak, properly aged, identical to Chamber A. but the pieces sitting in water showed white tendrils of mold crawling along the grain. Ruined. Months of her father's labor dissolved into pulp by groundwater he could not have predicted. She counted what remained usable. 2.5 cubic meters of dry oak in the elevated section. She added it to what she already had. Chamber minus what she had already burned held roughly 2 cubic meters. Total accessible fuel across both chambers, 4.5 cubic meters. She needed 8. Callista sat down on the dry section of Chamber B's floor and performed the calculation one final time. The shortfall was 3.5 cubic meters. Even if she managed to salvage the waterlogged wood, which would require weeks of drying, she did not have the number, still fell short. She stared at the water creeping across the chamber floor and felt something shift inside her, not panic, something quieter and more dangerous. Reason. Cold mathematical reason that began assembling an alternative future with the efficiency of an accountant closing out a failed ledger. If she sold the claim tomorrow, Whitaker would pay $25. Enough for a stagecoach ticket to Minneapolis. Enough for 1 month's rent. Enough for her and the girls to survive in a city where survival did not require descending into holes in the earth and counting wood by lantern light. Nerissa would be warm. Temperance would stop asking when they could go home. Callista would push needles through fabric 16 hours a day and try not to think about the man who had spent 7 years building something his daughter could not use because water had claimed it first. She was calculating the cost of a winter coat for Nerissa in Minneapolis prices when her hand resting on the chamber floor rushed against something that was not earth. Wood. Smooth, flat, manufactured, buried under a thin layer of dirt in the far corner, the one farthest from the seepage. Callista scraped the dirt away with her fingers and found finger holes carved into the surface. A false floor. She gripped the holes and pulled. The boards lifted, revealing a vertical shaft that dropped into darkness below. Chamber C was not beside Chamber B, it was beneath it. Callista lowered the lantern on a rope and watched it descend 3 meters before touching bottom. The shaft was narrow, perhaps 60 centimeters across, with footholds carved into the stone walls. No ladder, no rungs, just notches barely wide enough for a boot toe cut by a man who had understood that the person using them might need every advantage he could engineer into rock. She climbed down. The space that opened beneath her was larger than either of the chambers above. 6 meters wide, 7 meters long, ceiling just over 2 meters, and filled, completely, overwhelmingly, impossibly filled with oak. Floor to ceiling, wall to wall, row after row with narrow gaps between the stacks that allowed air to circulate and prevented moisture from building. The wood was immaculate, split into uniform pieces cured to a dryness that made each one feel lighter than its size suggested. Callista picked up a piece and brought it close to the lantern flame. The grain was tight and clean, not a trace of rot, not a mark of insect damage. Perfect. She did not count the stacks. She did not need to. The sheer volume of wood in this chamber answered every calculation she had run, every sleepless night she had spent with pencil and paper, every number that had closed around her without exits. 5.5 cubic meters, maybe 6. Combined with chambers A and B, the total exceeded 10. Enough for 2 winners, enough for anything Dakota could produce. On the wall, she found the charcoal inscription Norval had written 1 month before he died. She read it twice, her lips moving, the lantern trembling in her hand. Then Callista Norcross knelt on the dirt floor 9 meters below the surface of the earth and wept in a way she had not wept since the day she learned her father was dead and buried before she could reach him. She wept for the weight he had carried alone, for the future he had prepared but would never see, for the gift that required her to descend into darkness to understand the full measure of the man who had built it. Her father had not failed. He had built redundancy into the system. 3 chambers at different depths, different access points, different preservation conditions. If one flooded, 2 remained. If one collapsed, 2 held. If one was discovered by the wrong person, 2 stayed secret. He had constructed a fuel supply that could not fail unless all 3 failed simultaneously. When she finally stopped crying, she climbed back to the surface and locked the well. Dawn was 2 hours away. Her daughters slept above a fortune in fuel they would never know about until they were old enough to understand what their grandfather had done. 2 days later, Philomena Satterley returned, this time without eggs or pretense. Barnett saw you at the well at 2 in the morning. 2 nights running, lantern rope hauling something up. She stood in Callista's doorway with her arms crossed and her jaw set in the expression of a woman who had survived 9 winters by being suspicious of everything. If you stole someone's wood and hid it in that well, the man you stole from will find out. And out here, justice comes faster from a neighbor's anger than from any courthouse. The accusation hung between them. Callista understood what Ruth was really saying. Theft of firewood in Dakota territory was not a property crime. It was attempted murder by proxy. You take a man's fuel, you take his life. The penalty administered informally by neighbors who could not wait for circuit judges was severe enough that the threat alone should have made Callista confess if confession were warranted. She made a decision in 3 seconds that would shape everything that followed. Come with me. She led Ruth to the well, opened the lock, and took her down to Chamber A. Only Chamber A. She showed her the stacked oak, the timber, bracing the charcoal diagram on the wall. She covered Norval's personal message to her with her hand as Ruth examined the space. She explained that her father had built this over 7 years in secret. Ruth stood in the center of the chamber for a full minute without speaking. She ran her fingers along a timber brace. She picked up a piece of oak and examined the grain. Then she set it down carefully, placing it back exactly where she had found it, and looked at Callista with an expression that held equal parts respect and calculation. I will not tell anyone, but you owe me, Callista. When winter is over, you teach Barnett how to build one of these. Callista nodded. The secret now had 2 keepers. On November 13th, the first snow fell. Not the light dusting that marked autumn's retreat, but heavy wind-driven snow that accumulated 3 centimeters in the first hour and showed no sign of stopping. Callista had been preparing for this moment. She worked through the entire night, descending to Chamber C and loading the canvas harness with 22 kilograms of oak per trip. Up through the narrow shaft, through Chamber B, stepping around the frozen edges of the water, through Chamber A, up the main ladder, 28 rungs, each one a negotiation between exhaustion and necessity. Out into wind that tried to rip the harness from her grip, across 15 meters of open ground to the cabin. By 6 in the morning, she had moved 1 cubic meter to the surface. She carried it inside, stacked it beside the stove, and fed the firebox until heat poured from the iron and the cabin transformed. Nerissa and Temperance woke to warmth they had not felt in weeks. Temperance pressed her palm against the window where frost was melting into droplets and said, "Mama, the window is crying." Callista pulled her daughter close and thought about what it meant that a 3-year-old had never seen condensation on glass because the cabin had never been warm enough to produce it. That afternoon, while the girls played on the floor in air that felt almost tropical compared to the previous weeks, Hortense Thorburn appeared at the cabin door breathless and coatless, having run from the road where she had been watching for her husband's return from town. She spoke fast. Whitaker told Roscoe he will inspect your land the moment the first storm passes. He is bringing a witness to document that you have made no improvements. Roscoe agreed to go with him. The words registered slowly, each one adding weight to a burden Callista thought she had already measured. Roscoe Thorburn, who had looked at her daughters and predicted their deaths, was going to help the man trying to steal their home. Roscoe will testify against me. Agnes's voice dropped. Roscoe does not hate you, Callista. He believes you will die, and he thinks helping Whitaker take the land quickly is mercy. In his mind, the sooner you lose the claim, the sooner you leave, the sooner your daughters live. He thinks he is being kind. She paused, pulling her coat tighter against the wind pouring through the open door. But if you survive this winter, if you are standing here in March with smoke in your chimney and children in your yard, Roscoe will have to face the possibility that he was wrong. And the last time Roscoe was wrong about Winter Clementine and the boys died, he has spent 5 years telling himself that no amount of preparation could have saved them. If your father's preparation saves you, that story falls apart. Agnes left as the snow thickened. Callista closed the door and stood with her back against it, breathing hard, understanding for the first time that surviving winter was not just a matter of fuel and temperature. It was evidence. The only evidence that could protect her claim was her own living body standing on this land when the snow melted. November 14th. Nerissa woke with a fever. Callista knew the moment she pressed her palm to her daughter's forehead. The heat was wrong, not the warmth of a child who had slept under heavy blankets, but the furnace glow of a body at war was something that had been building in Nerissa's chest for days. The cough that had started as an occasional dry sound had deepened into something wet and persistent, rattling in Nerissa's lungs with every breath. Fever needed warmth. The body fought infection better when kept at temperature, allowed to sweat, given the energy to burn the invader out. But maintaining the cabin at the temperature Nerissa needed meant feeding the stove at twice the normal rate. Every piece of oak Callista added to the firebox was a piece subtracted from the margin between survival and catastrophe. She chose her daughter. She fed the stove until it roared, until the cabin reached 18 degrees, until Nerissa stopped shivering and Temperance stopped asking why her sister was making those sounds. And she watched the wood pile inside the cabin shrink with the steady inevitability of sand through glass. November 15th. The storm's second wave arrived with a violence that made the first seem like a warning. Wind that screamed, temperature that dropped to -42, visibility that collapsed to nothing. The well entrance vanished beneath 1.5 meters of wind-packed snow. Callista was trapped above ground with approximately 18 hours of fuel while 10 cubic meters sat unreachable beneath her feet. By 11 that night, the woodpile had shrunk to 30 pieces. Nerissa's breathing filled the cabin with sounds that Callista would hear in her nightmares for the rest of her life. Temperance had crawled into bed beside her sister, one hand tangled in Nerissa's hair, creating between their small bodies a warmth that blankets alone could not provide. Callista sat at the table and did something she had not done since arriving in Dakota. She wrote a letter, not to family, not to a friend, to Roscoe Thorburn. Mr. Thorburn, if you find this letter beside 3 bodies, know this. Beneath the well there is fuel enough for 2 winters. My father built 3 chambers. I was not strong enough to bring it up. Please tell someone. Do not let his work die with us. She folded the letter and placed it on the table. Then she stood up and put on her father's coat. She did not mail the letter. She went to dig out the well. 30 minutes in -42 darkness. Shovel throwing snow downwind. Hole filling almost as fast as she emptied it. The lock frozen. She struck it with the shovel handle twice before something inside gave. Then down. 28 rungs with ice on every surface. Through chamber A, through Chamber B, where the water had frozen into formations that caught her lantern light and scattered it. Down the narrow shaft to Chamber C, footholds slick with condensation that had turned to ice in the deeper cold seeping from above. She loaded the harness with 35 kilograms. Too much. She knew it was too much. But Nerissa's breathing was in her ears, and the arithmetic of fever plus cold plus time left no room for conservative estimates. The climb back up the narrow shaft took everything she had. At the 8th foothold, her right hand opened without her permission. Fingers that had been gripping stone simply released nerves and tendons overridden by cold and exhaustion. Her weight shifted backward. For one full second, Callista Norcross hung in absolute darkness, 9 meters underground with one hand on the wall and nothing beneath her but 3 meters of empty air and a stone floor that would break whatever it caught. Her left hand found a hold 2 meters down. Instinct, not strength, not skill. The blind, desperate grab of a body that refused to die before its children were warm. The impact wrenched her shoulder in ways that sent white light across her vision, but she held. She hung there gasping and thought the only thought that mattered. If she fell, Nerissa and Temperance would wake in a cabin growing cold. They would call for her. She would not come. They would not understand why. They would wait beside a stove that slowly went dark, and the coal would find them the way it had found Clementine Thorburn and her sons 5 years ago. That thought, not the pain in her shoulder, not the numbness in her fingers, carried her up the remaining holds. She dragged the harness through both chambers, up the main ladder, out into a world reduced to white noise and killing wind. The rope she had tied between well and cabin was her only navigation. She followed it hand over hand, pulling the harness behind her, blind deaf to everything except the fiber under her palms. 3 meters from the cabin door, she tripped on something, buried in the snow, and went down hard enough to scatter oak across the ground. She gathered the pieces in darkness by touch, counting by weight, cramming them back into the harness, while wind tried to bury them and her hands tried to stop working. The cabin door opened and warmth spilled out along with Temperance's voice. "Mama." The word was more fear than question. Callista fell through the doorway. Oak scattered across the dirt floor. She fed the stove without removing her coat or gloves. Flames caught. Heat pushed outward. Nerissa was awake, watching with fever-bright eyes. Temperance wrapped both arms around Callista's neck with a grip that would have hurt if Callista could feel anything beyond the place where exhaustion meets the far edge of endurance. She checked Nerissa's forehead, still hot, but no hotter, holding steady. She counted the wood she had brought up, 32 pieces, 12 hours of fuel if she burned carefully, 8 if she maintained fever-fighting temperature. Dawn, November 16th. The storm raged. Callista fed the stove every hour and watched her fuel supply diminish. By noon, 20 pieces. By evening, 15. At 9 that night, someone hammered on the cabin door. Callista opened it to find Dorrit Ludlow standing in the storm. 30 years old, face white, lips the color of a bruise, snow caked into her hair and clothing. Behind her, somewhere in the darkness, 3 children waited in a cabin with no fire. "My husband fell repairing the roof. Broken leg, he cannot chop wood. We ran out this morning. Please, anything you can spare." Callista looked at her woodpile. 20 pieces, enough for 8 hours at current burn rate. If she gave half, each household had 4 hours. If the storm lasted longer than 4 hours, which it would, both families would face the same cold with half the defense. She looked at Dorrit Ludlow and saw herself 6 weeks ago, standing in Roscoe Thorburn's yard, with 2 daughters clutching her skirts, asking for mercy from a man who refused because he believed mercy was just slow murder. Roscoe had been protecting himself from the guilt of involvement. He had done the math and decided that helping was merely prolonging inevitable death. He had been right about the math. He had been catastrophically wrong about everything else. Callista pulled 8 pieces of oak from the pile and pressed them into Dorrit's arms. Dorrit stared at the wood, then at Callista, then at Nerissa lying in the bed with fever sweat glistening on her forehead. She understood what she was looking at. A mother giving away fuel her own sick child needed to a stranger whose name she barely knew. She tried to speak. Callista shook her head. Go, before the cold takes what you are carrying. Dorrit disappeared into the white. Callista closed the door and counted what remained. 12 pieces, 5 hours. Nerissa's breathing had not improved. The storm had not weakened, and she had just given away a third of her remaining fuel to a woman she had met twice. She waited 1 hour, then she put on the coat and went back out. The second descent was worse than the first. Her body had cataloged every injury, every strain, and presented the bill with compound interest. Vision narrowing, thighs burning, right shoulder refusing to lift above horizontal. She loaded the harness with 25 kilograms, climbed back through 3 chambers and up 28 rungs, and followed the rope home through wind that had found new ways to cut. But there was a difference this time. When she loaded the harness in Chamber C, she did not calculate for her family alone. She packed 40 kilograms, 15 more than she could safely carry, enough for her cabin and enough for the Ludlow family. Every additional kilogram on the climb up the narrow shaft was a conversation between her shoulders and the laws of physics that her shoulders were losing. By the 10th foothold, her legs were shaking so badly that each step required a conscious decision to continue. By the 20th, she could see only the stone directly in front of her face, everything else swallowed by a darkness that was partly the absence of light and partly her body shutting down non-essential systems to preserve the ones keeping her alive. She did not fall this time, but when she reached the surface, she could not stand. She crawled along the rope to the cabin, dragging the harness through snow that came past her elbows, moving on hands and knees through a world that had been reduced to the 15 meters between the well and the door. Inside, she divided the wood, 2/3 for her family. 1/3 she bundled in a canvas sack and tied to the rope outside the door, where Dorrit Ludlow would find it at first light. November 17th. 8 pieces of oak remained, but Nerissa's fever had broken. Callista felt it when she pressed her palm to her daughter's forehead at 7 that evening. Still warm, but the furnace heat had diminished to something closer to human. Nerissa's breathing had eased the congestion in her chest, loosening as warmth and time did their work. She slept with one arm around Temperance, peaceful for the first time in days. Callista faced the decision she had been delaying since the storm began. 8 pieces, 4 hours of fuel. The wind outside had shifted its howl, diminishing from rage to something merely relentless. She could feel it in the way the cabin had stopped shaking. The storm was trending toward exhaustion. Maybe she could descend again. Her body was failing, shoulders, wrecked hands blistered through double gloves, weight dropping from a frame that had none to spare. But she could do it, probably. One more trip, one more negotiation with gravity and stone and the vertical dark. Or she could wait. Gamble that 8 pieces of oak would last until the storm broke. Gamble that the wind she felt dying was actually dying and not merely gathering itself for a third wave. She chose to wait. The hours passed in single pieces of oak added to the firebox one at a time, each one a small prayer, each one a measurement of time remaining before the cold won. At midnight, she added the last piece and watched it catch. She watched flames consume wood that her father had cut and split and carried piece by piece into chambers he had dug with tools and stubbornness, and a love that required no explanation because it explained itself through the simple act of existing. She burned bark strips, wood shavings, broken bits too small to matter individually, but collectively enough to extend the heat another hour, then another. By the time true dawn arrived, the stove had gone cold, but the temperature inside the cabin had dropped only to just above freezing. And through the window, for the first time in 4 days, Callista could see blue sky. She went outside into air that was -28 and utterly still. The wind had died completely, leaving drifts that rose 3 meters high in places, sculpted into shapes that caught the early light and threw it back in blues and whites that looked almost beautiful if you forgot what they had cost. She began digging out the well, not frantically, not with the desperate energy of someone racing against wind and darkness. Systematically, one shovelful at a time. It took 2 hours to expose the well cover completely. By the time she finished, the sun had risen high enough to cast real light across the prairie, and Roscoe Thorburn was riding toward her cabin on a horse that left dark tracks through the snow. He stopped in the yard and dismounted. He studied Callista with an expression she had never seen on his face before. Something between shock and recognition, as if he were looking at a person he had met in a previous life and only now remembered. "Mrs. Norcross." His voice carried the careful neutrality of a man trying not to reveal that everything he believed had just been proven wrong. "Mr. Thorburn, you are alive." "I am. My girls are inside, warm. Nerissa had fever during the storm, but it broke last night." Thorburn walked to the well and looked down into the shaft she had uncovered. He saw the ladder, the stone walls, the rope and pulley mechanism. He stared for a long time. "How deep?" 9 meters total. Then there is a door, then chambers. Chambers. He repeated the word, letting the plural do its work. "My father built them. Over 7 years. In secret." Thorburn descended without hesitation, moving with the practiced ease of a man who had worked in dangerous conditions his entire adult life. Callista heard him reach the bottom, heard the hidden door open, heard his boots on the tunnel floor, then silence that stretched long enough to make her wonder if the chamber had collapsed. When he climbed back up, his face had changed. The certainty that had defined him since the day he told her she would watch her daughters freeze, that absolute conviction in his own judgment, was gone. What replaced it was something Roscoe Thorburn had not worn in 5 years. "How much is down there?" 8 cubic meters remaining. "Was 10 before the storm. I have used 2. Silence. Then barely above a whisper, 10 cubic meters of oak, cured, stored at constant temperature, fuel for 2 winters. "Yes, and your father built this alone, without telling anyone. He knew what it was worth, knew what neighbors might do to claim it." Thorburn flinched. The words were not directed at him specifically, but they landed on him anyway because he was standing in the exact spot where a man who had been right about everything had been called a fool by everyone who knew him. He looked toward the cabin. Nerissa and Temperance were visible in the window, watching their mother talk to the man who had predicted their deaths. When he spoke again, his voice was different. Not flat, not certain, fractured by something that had been locked inside him for 5 years and was now breaking through walls he had built to contain it. "Clementine, my first wife. When I got back after the blizzard, she had burned everything. The chairs, the shelves, the cradle the baby slept in. She burned the cradle, and it was not enough. The wood ran out, and the cold did not." He stopped. His jaw worked. Callista watched a man dismantle the story he had told himself every night for half a decade. "If I had built what your father built, if I had thought that far ahead, if I had dug instead of telling myself that the winters could not be beaten, and the only sane response was to accept the losses and move forward." He did not finish the sentence. He did not need to. Callista understood what he was saying, and more importantly, what it cost him to say it. Roscoe Thorburn was not merely admitting he had been wrong about Callista. He was confronting the possibility that Clementine and his sons might have lived if he had been the kind of man who prepared for disasters instead of the kind who accepted them as inevitable. I will talk to Whitaker. I will not testify against you. He mounted his horse and rode away without looking back. Callista stood beside the well and watched him diminish across the white prairie until he was just a dark point moving against the snow. She was alive. Nerissa was recovering. The well was open. The fuel was accessible. Roscoe Thorburn had reversed himself so completely that the ground between them had shifted from hostility to something she was not yet ready to name. But on the table inside the cabin, beside the cold stove, the letter she had written to Roscoe Thorburn 3 nights ago still lay folded and unsealed. The one that began with, "If you find this letter beside 3 bodies." She had not destroyed it. Part of her understood that she needed to keep it, not as reminder of weakness, but as proof that the distance between surrender and survival had been measured in minutes, not miles. She had written that letter and then stood up and walked into the storm. Both things were true. Both things were her. The sky was clear. The temperature was brutal, but survivable. And somewhere to the north, Ransom Whitaker was reading the same skiing and recalculating his timeline because the widow he had expected to find frozen by Christmas was hauling oak from a hole in the ground that nobody knew existed. Winter had only begun. The rest of that winter tried to kill Callista Norcross 4 more times, and 4 more times she descended into the earth and came back carrying oak. But something had changed after the November storm, and it was not the weather or the wood supply or the condition of her hands which had scarred into a topography of calluses and healed blisters that would never fully soften. What changed was Callista herself. The first time she had gone down in a blizzard, she had been afraid. The second time, desperate. The third time, she had loaded extra weight for a family she barely knew and crawled home on her knees. By January, when the 4th major storm drove temperatures below -43 on 3 separate occasions, Callista descended the well the way other women descended their porch steps, with caution but without terror. Her body had learned the route, 28 rungs in the main shaft, the door that swung on its hidden pivot, the passage through Chamber A, the frozen edges of Chamber B, the narrow vertical drop to Chamber C, where her boots found the carved footholds by memory in the dark. Her shoulders had built the kind of strength that comes not from exercise but from repetition under load, the dense functional muscle of a body that had been asked to do impossible things until they became merely difficult. She was no longer the seamstress from Minneapolis who had stood at a crossroads wondering which direction led to survival. She was something the prairie had made, something her father had trusted the prairie to make if it did not kill her first. In the second week of January, Dalton Ludlow appeared at Callista's cabin carrying half a butchered hog wrapped in canvas, the weight of it bowing his shoulders despite the crutch under his left arm. His broken leg had healed enough for him to walk, though he moved with the deliberate gait of a man negotiating a truce with pain at every step. He set the meat on Callista's table and stood back breathing hard, his face carrying an expression Callista had seen on Roscoe Thorburn's face in November, the look of a man rearranging his understanding of the world. "My wife told me what you did. You gave us wood when you had 20 pieces left, and your girl was burning with fever. I cannot live owing that debt." Callista looked at the meat. Protein her daughters needed. Protein she needed. Calories that would rebuild what the winter had been stripping from her body for 3 months. She tried to refuse. Dalton shook his head. "Dorrit said you did not hesitate. Said you pulled the wood from the pile and put it in her arms like it was nothing. But it was not nothing. You gave a stranger what your own child needed." I have thought about that every day since November, and I still do not understand how a person does that. Callista accepted the pork. It lasted 6 weeks and changed the trajectory of her family's nutrition at exactly the moment when starvation had been approaching from a direction she had not been watching. Before Dalton left, he asked the question she had been expecting. "Where do you get the wood?" She told him. Her father had built underground storage beneath the well. 3 chambers at different depths stocked with cured oak over 7 years. Dalton listened without interrupting, his eyes fixed on the well visible through the cabin window. When she finished, he was quiet for a long time. "When spring comes, I want to build one for my family. Can you teach me?" Callista said yes. It was the second time she had agreed to share her father's design. Philomena Satterley had been the first. The number would grow. But before spring arrived, before the snow retreated, and the ground softened enough for anyone to dig anything, Callista had to survive a different kind of assault. One that came not from weather but from paper filed in triplicate at a territorial office by a man who wore polished boots to business that should have shamed him. On a Sunday in late January, Callista walked into the Coopertown church for the first time since arriving in Dakota. She needed supplies from the general store, and the store opened after services. She also needed the community to see her alive, to see Narissa healthy and Temperance growing, and the Norcross widow standing upright in a territory that was supposed to have buried her by Christmas. Reverend Langford saw her from the pulpit. Something shifted behind his eyes. She had been an abstraction to him, a cautionary tale he could reference in sermons about pride and divine will. Now she was sitting in the third pew with 2 well-fed daughters, and the cautionary tale was refusing to end the way he had written it. He adjusted his sermon, not dramatically, not in ways that anyone who had not heard his previous remarks would notice. But Callista noticed. She heard the pivot when he began speaking about those among us who place their own judgment above the wisdom of their community, who call stubbornness strength and mistake survival for vindication. Narissa tugged Callista's sleeve. "Mama, is he talking about us?" Callista squeezed her daughter's hand. "It does not matter what he is talking about." After services on the church steps, where the congregation milled and gossiped and assessed each other's livestock and intentions, Hortense Thorburn walked directly to Reverend Langford and stopped close enough that the conversation could not be mistaken for casual. "Reverend, the next time you preach about stubbornness, I hope you will also preach about the kind of pride that lets a man stand at a pulpit and lecture a woman who has done more surviving in 4 months than most of us manage in a decade." The church steps went silent. 20 people standing in the cold heard Hortense Thorburn challenge the minister to his face, and every one of them understood the implications. Agnes was Roscoe Thorburn's wife. Roscoe was the most respected farmer in the county. If Agnes spoke this way publicly, it meant Roscoe either approved or had lost control of his household, and neither interpretation left Langford in a comfortable position. Roscoe stood 3 feet behind his wife. He did not speak. He did not pull Agnes back. He did not smile or frown or reveal anything at all except the simple fact of his presence beside a woman who had just said what he was not yet ready to say himself. Langford recovered with the practiced grace of a man accustomed to navigating social confrontation from an elevated position. He turned to Callista with an expression that had softened from judgment to something more cautious. "Mrs. Norcross, if I was wrong about your situation, I pray for your continued safety and that of your children." Callista met his eyes. "Pray for the Ludlow family, Reverend. They need it more than I do." Langford studied her for a moment, then nodded. Not an apology, but an acknowledgement that the ground between them had shifted enough that the old positions were no longer tenable. The legal complaint arrived on March 9th, delivered by postal rider, along with a summons to appear before a three-man panel in Coopertown, and on March 23rd. Ransom Whitaker had filed it on March 3rd, 6 days after the last major snow, timed precisely to land before spring planting consumed everyone's attention and energy. Callista read the document 3 times each pass, revealing implications she had missed on the previous reading. The complaint argued that discovery of underground storage containing approximately 10 cubic meters of cured oak, estimated value $80 to $100, constituted material improvement not reported in the original claim filing. Callista Norcross had not built the vault herself, inheritance rather than sweat equity, therefore possible violation of Homestead Act requirements that claimants personally improve their land. Request for official assessment in consideration of forfeiture proceedings. The strategy was precise. Whitaker was not directly claiming the vault or the land. He was constructing a legal framework that would force Callista to either pay back taxes on the vault's assessed value, which would exceed her ability to pay, or forfeit the claim entirely due to technical violation of homestead requirements. Either outcome delivered the land to Whitaker, the law used as a lever to pry loose what money could not buy. 1 week before the hearing, Sumner Whitaker rode to Callista's cabin at dusk. He did not dismount. His horse stamped and shifted beneath him, reading the tension in its rider's body. "My father sent my brother Nestor onto your property on March 1st while you were in Coopertown. No permission, no court order. Nestor measured the vault, sketched the chambers, documented everything. My father used that data in his complaint. Why are you telling me this? Because my father is wrong, and I do not have the courage to say it to his face. But I can say it to you." Silas turned his horse. At the fence line, he paused without looking back. "If you can prove your father built the vault legally during his time on the claim, and that you inherited both the land and the improvements through direct succession, the complaint collapses. Every piece of evidence my father has depends on the argument that the vault was hidden. If you can show it was built openly over years by the original claimant, there is nothing to hide and nothing to reassess." He rode into the darkening prairie, and Callista stood in the yard holding the summons, and understanding that the man trying to take her land had a son willing to betray him for the sake of something as inconvenient as conscience. She went to Roscoe Thorburn's farm the following morning. Roscoe was ready. He had been ready since November, since descending into Chamber A and climbing back out with his certainties in ruins. From beneath his workbench, he pulled a wooden crate containing 5 years of correspondence with Norval Norcross. Letters in Norwegian that referenced the well project in detail. Dates, descriptions of excavation, references to stone hauling and timber bracing and the fuel storage problem that Norval had described to his neighbor, openly disguised only by the assumption that everyone made, that a man digging a well was looking for water. He also produced 2 letters written in English by Phineas Culver, a farmer who had died in the November blizzard, letters that described seeing Norval haul stone from the creek beds in 1882 and 1883. "Your father and I exchanged letters for 5 years. He mentioned the well project in nearly every one from 81 onward. Never said what it was for, just that he was working on it continuously." Roscoe set the letters on the table between them. "I owe you an apology, Mrs. Norcross, not for the arithmetic. The arithmetic was correct for anyone who did not have that vault. I was wrong because I looked at you and saw only what you lacked instead of what you were willing to do." The hearing convened in Coopertown's Territorial Land Office on March 23rd at 10 in the morning. The 3-man panel consisted of Territorial Agent James Morrison, County Assessor William Drake, and Circuit Judge Hiram Prescott, who happened to be Philomena Satterley's brother-in-law, a detail that Whitaker had apparently not discovered before filing his complaint. The room held perhaps 20 people on benches borrowed from the church next door. Callista sat at the front with Nerissa and Temperance on either side. Both girls in their best clothes, looking solemn in the way children look when they understand that something important is happening around them, even if they cannot name it. Behind them sat Roscoe Thorburn, Agnes Philomena Satterley Dalton, and Dorrit Ludlow, and 7 other homesteaders who had known Norval Norcross or witnessed some part of his 7-year project. Whitaker sat alone on the opposite side of the room, suit coat pressed, boots polished, leather folder containing his complaint and the surveyor's notes his son Nestor had gathered without permission on March 1st. He presented his case with the confidence of a man who believed the law was a precision instrument and he was holding it by the correct end. The vault was a substantial improvement not reported in the original filing. Callista had not built it. Inheritance did not satisfy the Act's requirement of personal improvement. The vault's value warranted reassessment and possible forfeiture. Judge Prescott thanked him and turned to the gallery. Roscoe Thorburn approached first. He laid out the letters, 3 in Norwegian and 2 in English, covering a timeline from 1881 to 1886. 5 years of documented correspondence proving that Norval Norcross had worked on the well project continuously and openly discussed it with neighbors and maintained it as an ongoing improvement to his legally occupied claim. Philomena Satterley followed with a written statement from Barnett describing occasions between 1882 and 1885 when the boy had helped Norval haul timber for what Norval called bracing work. A farmer named Elbridge Dunlap testified about selling Norval oak in 1883, believing it was for cabin repairs. Another man described helping move Norval's forge to the well site for metalwork. Each piece of testimony added another layer to a timeline that stretched 7 years and involved half the county as unwitting witnesses. Then Dalton Ludlow stood. He was not on any witness list. His testimony was not about the vault at all. I want to add something. Mrs. Norcross gave my family firewood during the November blizzard when she had 20 pieces left in her cabin and her daughter was burning with fever. She split what she could not afford to split and put it in my wife's arms at a cost that could have killed her own children. If that is not the act of someone actively building and sustaining a homestead and a community in the fullest sense of the Homestead Act, then I do not know what qualifies. The room was silent. The testimony had nothing to do with property law or inheritance provisions, but it changed the temperature of the proceedings in ways that legal arguments could not. Callista was no longer the abstract figure in Whitaker's complaint, the widow who had inherited advantages she did not earn. She was the woman who had given away fuel during a blizzard while her daughter lay sick because a stranger knocked on her door, and she could not bring herself to be the person who said no. Whitaker shifted in his chair. His expression had not changed, but his posture had. A settling inward, a contraction of the shoulders that suggested the awareness of a position becoming indefensible. Then Sumner Whitaker stood up in the back row. Every person in the room turned. Whitaker's own son, standing in a hearing his father had initiated, moving toward the front with the measured gait of a man who had rehearsed this walk in his mind for weeks and was now discovering that rehearsal bore no resemblance to performance. I want to add testimony. Whitaker's face went white. Not red, white. The blood draining rather than rising, which was somehow worse. The response of a man watching something collapse that he had believed was structurally sound. Silas spoke to the panel, his voice steady despite hands that trembled at his sides. My father sent my brother Nestor to survey Mrs. Norcross's property on March 1st of this year. He entered her land without her knowledge, without her permission, and without a court order. He measured the vault, documented its contents, and provided that information to my father, who used it as the basis for this complaint. The room erupted, not in shouts, in the sharp collective intake of breath that comes when 20 people simultaneously understand that what they are witnessing is a son dismantling his father's case from the inside. Judge Prescott restored order and asked Silas why he had come forward. Because the land belongs to her. If it did not, my father would not have needed to enter it by stealth. Prescott made a note. Then he looked at Whitaker, whose hands were flat on the table in front of him, pressing down as if trying to hold something in place that had already shifted beyond recovery. The panel withdrew for 20 minutes. When they returned, Prescott read from a decision written in careful script on official land office paper. The panel finds that the underground storage vault on claim number 4427 was constructed over approximately 7 years by original claimant Norval Norcross during his legal occupancy of the property. Documentary evidence and witness testimony establish a clear timeline of construction beginning no later than 1881 and continuing until the claimant's death in August 1886. Vault construction constitutes legitimate homestead improvement as defined by the Homestead Act of 1862 and subsequent amendments. Callista Norcross, as direct heir and legal successor to Norval Norcross's claim, has inherited both land and improvements through permissible succession. The vault does not constitute a hidden asset requiring reassessment, nor does its value trigger additional tax liability, as said improvements were built during the original claimant's occupancy and properly transferred through inheritance. Furthermore, the panel notes that Mrs. Norcross has made additional improvements to the property since taking occupancy in September 1886, including cabin repairs, establishment of a poultry operation, and maintenance of the storage system her father built. These actions demonstrate active homesteading consistent with the Act's requirements. Ransom Whitaker's petition for forfeiture is denied. Prescott set down the paper and looked at Whitaker directly. Mr. Whitaker, this panel strongly discourages future complaints that attempt to penalize homesteaders for their predecessors' competence. Using the law as a tool to acquire land you failed to purchase through legitimate means is not a proper channel and will not be tolerated by this office. Callista walked out of the land office into spring sunlight with her daughter's hands clasped in hers. Nerissa looked up and said, "Did we win?" Callista said yes. Temperance asked if they could get candy at the general store. Callista said yes to that too. Outside, Sumner Whitaker passed within arm's reach. He dipped his chin in the same small nod he had given the first time Callista saw him standing at the fence line, while his father issued threats from horseback. Callista returned it, a brief exchange that carried the weight of everything that had passed between their families, and required nothing more than the acknowledgement that decency sometimes survived in places where it should not have been able to grow. Behind them, Ransom Whitaker mounted his horse alone. He did not look at his son. 2 weeks after the hearing, Hortense Thorburn brought word that Whitaker had purchased Callista's $15 debt from the Coopertown General Store, flour lamp oil medicine for Nerissa during the winter. Whitaker was demanding payment within 30 days, knowing Callista had no cash. If she could not pay, he could petition for property lien. The vault held $80 worth of oak, but selling firewood in April when no one needed it would take months and expose the full extent of her reserves to every opportunist in the county. Philomena Satterley arrived the following day with a solution that Callista did not expect and initially refused. 5 families. Philomena counted them on her fingers. Mine, the Ludlows, the Dunlaps, the Porters, the Hales. Every one of us is building storage because of what you taught us, what you shared for free. We are paying you now. $3 each, 15 total. You clear the debt, and Whitaker has nothing left to swing. I gave freely. You do not owe me for knowledge. Ruth set her jaw. You gave freely. We pay because we choose to. There is a difference. Take the money, Callista. Let us be the kind of neighbors your father was protecting you from turned inside out. Callista accepted $15 assembled from 5 families who had learned to dig because she had taught them families who had survived a winter they might not have survived, because knowledge that Norval Norcross created in isolation had been released into a community by a daughter who understood that hoarding survival was its own form of death. She paid Whitaker's agent in Coopertown on the 29th day. The clerk counted the coins and bills and issued a receipt. Callista folded it into her coat pocket beside the brass key she still carried and walked back to the cabin where her daughters waited, and the well stood open and the prairie stretched away in every direction under a sky so large it seemed to contain the entire future. Whitaker never filed again. The ruling stood as precedent cited 3 times in the following decade when other homesteaders faced similar challenges to inherited improvements. The law which Whitaker had tried to use as a weapon became a shield for every family in the territory who had built something worth protecting and died before they could explain it to the people who needed it most. In the spring of 1889, Callista filed certification papers with the Territorial Land Office. 3 years since her father's death, the threshold required to prove up a homestead claim. She received approval in June. The 160 acres that had been Norval Norcross's dream became Callista Norcross's property. Not claim but title, not hope but fact. At the certification ceremony in Coopertown, Roscoe Thorburn stood and raised a glass. He spoke slowly, choosing each word with the care of a man who had learned what careless words could cost. Norval Norcross dug 9 meters into frozen ground and left his daughter 3 chambers filled with more than wood. He left proof that love does not announce itself in words. It announces itself in work so patient and so practical that it looks like nothing until the coldest winter proves it was everything. The room raised glasses. Callista sat with Nerissa and Temperance and felt 7 months of weight lifting from her shoulders in stages like ice breaking up on a river in spring. Not all at once. In pieces, each one releasing a sound she could almost hear. Clement Overstreet came to Dakota in the summer of 1891. A carpenter from Minnesota, 32 years old, hired to rebuild farms damaged by the brutal winters. He heard about the Norcross widow while working on a barn 10 kilometers from her claim. Heard about the vault and the storm, and the woman who descended 9 meters in the dark to haul oak for her daughters and for strangers. He visited her claim in July, asked to see the vault, and spent 2 hours underground studying the timber bracing and stone walls with the focused intensity of a man who recognized craftsmanship that exceeded anything he had produced in 20 years of professional work. When he climbed back up, he looked at Callista and said the most honest thing he had ever said to a woman he had just met. Your father was brilliant. This is the finest piece of practical engineering I have seen in my life. He was stubborn more than brilliant. I could build you a proper house right over the vault. Kitchen floor with a trap door straight down to the fuel supply. No more crossing open ground in blizzards. Why would you do that? Because I have been looking for someone who understands that preparation is not paranoia. And because your daughters deserve a house with real windows and wood floors. Build the house first, Callista said. If it is as good as you claim, we will talk about the rest. Clement built it in 3 months. 4 rooms, a fireplace of fitted fieldstone, glass windows that let in light without letting in wind, and in the kitchen floor a trap door that opened onto the ladder descending to Chamber A. Callista married him in November 1891, and for the first time in 5 years, winter arrived as a season instead of a siege. The vault remained in use until 1947 when rural electrification finally reached their section of the county and oil heat replaced the need for underground fuel storage. By then, 5 Norcross children had grown up learning to descend the ladder before they learned to read. Every November 1st, the entire family gathered to haul the winter supply to the surface. 5-year-olds carried kindling. Teenagers handled full splits. Adults loaded the harness and worked the pulley. A family tradition that turned the labor of survival into a ritual connecting them to a grandfather whose presence remained tangible in every stone he had placed, in every beam he had fitted. By 1900, 16 families in Griggs County had built underground storage modeled on Norval Norcross's design. Roscoe Thorburn's vault eventually held 18 cubic meters, enough for 3 winters, and he opened it to neighbors during the catastrophic winter of 1917, when temperatures stayed below -45 for 6 consecutive weeks and supply chains collapsed entirely. Barnett Satterley built 4 vaults over his lifetime, 1 for his mother's claim, 3 more for homesteads he helped establish as the county expanded westward. He became the informal expert on underground storage, consulted by farmers, territorial agents, and eventually state officials. When Dakota split into North and South, and the new governments wanted documentation of survival techniques that had kept settlers alive through conditions that still killed people every winter. Callista died in January 1932 at 78, having survived 46 Dakota winters. She spent her final conscious hour explaining to Clement exactly where the backup supply was stored in Chamber C, in case the family needed it after she was gone. Clement buried her beside Norval in Griggs County Cemetery. Norval's headstone, placed in 1886 by a minister who barely knew him, carried an inscription Clement had added in 1892. He built what she needed. Callista's read simply, "She believed in the well." The vault outlasted them all. It outlasted the need that had justified its creation. It outlasted the era that had made it necessary. In 1962, a historical society representative documented the 3 chambers for territorial archives. The stone walls stood solid after 80 years. The timber bracing had weathered, but remained structurally sound. The counterbalance doors still moved with single-hand pressure. In 1998, a graduate student researching homestead survival strategies discovered the file and wrote a thesis about underground fuel storage as adaptation to extreme climate. She contacted Norval Norcross's great-granddaughter, 63 years old, a civil engineer living in Fargo, the last living descendant still in Dakota. The great-granddaughter had not visited the vault since childhood. She remembered it mostly as the place her father took her during summer visits to the old house, a cool, dark space that smelled like earth and time, and something she could not name until she was old enough to recognize it as love made physical. She drove out to the claim in September 1998 with the graduate student and descended the ladder that had been reinforced with modern safety rails at some point in the intervening decades. Chamber A opened before her exactly as it had opened for Callista 112 years earlier. Stone walls, timber frames, air that carried the scent of a century compressed into a space that seemed both smaller and larger than memory suggested. The oak was gone. The last pieces had burned in 1947, but the structure remained. She walked through Chamber B, where the water damage from 1886 had long since dried, leaving mineral stains on the stone walls that mapped the waterline, like a record of the crisis that had almost ended everything. She descended the narrow shaft to Chamber C, using footholds her great-great-grandfather had carved and her great-grandmother had climbed in darkness, while a blizzard tried to kill everyone she loved. On the wall, 2 inscriptions. The first in charcoal faded but legible after more than a century. 3 chambers, 3 chances. 1 holds heat, 2 hold hope, all 3 hold love. July 1886. The second in a different hand added 3 years later, all 3 held. East 1889. The great-granddaughter stood in chamber C and pressed her palm against the stone wall where Norval Norcross had written his message and Callista Norcross had answered it. 2 hands separated by 3 years and connected by 9 meters of earth, and the understanding that some conversations do not require both speakers to be alive. She remembered what her father had told her during those childhood visits. Words she had been too young to absorb but old enough to store, waiting for the day they would mean what he intended. Love is not what you say. It is what you build when you know you will not be there to see it used. And the deepest preparation is the one that looks like nothing until you need it desperately and find it exactly where someone who loved you knew you would look. She climbed back to the surface and stood in September sunlight. The house Clement Overstreet had built still stood, maintained by tenants who paid rent to cousins who had moved to cities where winter was merely cold instead of lethal. The well entrance had been sealed with a concrete cap for safety. The trap door in the kitchen floor had been nailed shut decades ago, but beneath all of it, the chambers remained. Stone and timber and engineering that had outlasted the people it was built to save, outlasted the winters that had tested it, outlasted even the need that had justified its creation. It remained because Norval Norcross had looked at Dakota prairie in 1879 and seen not just land to claim, but a future to build for. Winters his daughter would face alone, storms he would not survive, but she might if he dug deep enough and planned far enough ahead and loved practically enough to express it in oak stored where only someone who knew the secret could find it. In Dakota territory, there were winters that came without wood, and there were fathers who wore brass keys around their necks. Norval Norcross understood something that most people never learn, that the coldest winter is not the one you survive. It is the one your children face after you are gone. So he dug 9 meters into frozen ground and filled what he built with everything his daughter would need to outlast what he could not. Callista had descended into that darkness during the worst storm of her first winter. She had hauled oak through conditions that broke her body in ways that never fully healed. She had given away fuel she could not spare because a stranger knocked, and she refused to become the kind of person who turned away. Then she had taught her neighbors to dig, shared the knowledge freely, and watched a community take root around an idea that Norval had planted alone in silence. The legacy was not the vault. Stone and timber would eventually crumble. The legacy was the people who learned to build for each other because one woman showed them what her father had shown her. That love is not shelter you provide. It is the capacity to shelter that you pass on. And the great-granddaughter standing in September, light with the graduate student beside her, and the prairie stretching away under a sky that seemed to hold the entire past and future, simultaneously understood at last what her father had been trying to tell her all those years ago. That the deepest preparation is the one that looks like nothing, until the coldest winter proves it was everything.